I regularly do some statistical analysis of the sport, looking at different common movement pairings, the duration of workouts, and specific movements. So here, I took a second look at wall balls and looking at all the events where wall balls have appeared in the CrossFit Open, the CrossFit quarterfinals, and the games. Here's what I found. The smallest chunking, in other words, the smallest set that you're asked to do at a shot was 15 reps in the entire history of wall balls. The largest chunking was 150 reps. The average chunking of all those events over the Open, quarterfinals, and games was 57 reps. So for a CrossFit competitor, improving your wall ball capacity must be context specific. So in other words, you have to train in the way that you're going to be tested. This means aggressively large sets under high systemic fatigue. Today we're going to dive into protocols to maximize your success in these types of tests and ultimately improve your wall ball capacity. Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is the Fitness Movement. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by ZOAR Fitness. ZOAR Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver training content to coaches and athletes like you. The site has educational resources on everything from program design and exercise physiology to skill progressions and movement breakdowns. And in terms of programming, we have our online training program, The Protocol, and I also offer one-on-one remote coaching. It's all at one place, ZOARfitness.com. And welcome back to my rant on improving your wall ball capacity. So if you're a person who's ever felt gassed when you're doing a wall ball workout, and you're a person who cares about your CrossFit performance, whether you're a competitor or you just like to compete against yourself and your own performance or against other people within your community, this is going to be the perfect episode for you. We're going to go over heaps of training protocols, right? Real world examples, stuff I've actually used on my athletes or even on myself. And a quick note, one thing that you're not going to be hearing me talk about and mention in this episode are things that are fixed that can't be controlled and are therefore of no use for us to focus on, right? So you're not going to be hearing me talk about an athlete's height or their limb length, right? Certainly those can come into the conversation if we can talk about how that actually impacts someone's movement. But if we're using that as an excuse, that's a terrible way to think about wall balls, right? In this sport, every single person who comes into the sport of CrossFit, right, has something that they're predisposed to being bad at for the sport. So if you're short, get over it, move on, and actually control the controllables. Moving on, that line for today, 3 different parts. Part number 1 is how is it tested? So how are wall balls being tested? And this is a very important anchor for our conversation because again, we're talking about improving your performance in the way that CrossFit tests wall balls. So that's an important caveat to everything else that we're going to go through, which is going to include part 2 of how do wall balls differ from other seemingly similar movements. So for example, a thruster seems very much like a wall ball, right? It's a squat and a press, right? How is it different? There's distinct ways that wall balls are different. And then part 3 is training protocols. So figuring out how can we actually improve our wall ball capacity for the way which it's being tested for the sport. So how are wall balls being tested? This is a very important question. And really, again, it's providing an anchor point for this conversation because it's saying, this is how we're being tested and this is the end goal. How do we actually optimize for that end goal of performing the best we can on these types of tests? So unless you know how it's being tested, you can't train for it. And that goes the case for any sport, which is why this statistical analysis is really important. And I think it goes all the way back to just looking at individual workouts and seeing what they were. So I'm going to read every single open workout that has a wall ball in it, right? And it would be really easy to check out during this. However, what I want you to do is try to, as I'm reading through these, don't just kind of zone out. Think about, okay, what themes are showing up in this? Like, what is the style of the workout? What is wall balls being commonly paired with? How many reps are showing up at a shot? What is the time duration that this is showing up at? All of those types of things. So as I go through these, pay attention to those things. Open 11.5, which is the very first year that the Open was held. It was a 20-minute AMRAP of 5 power cleans, 10 toes to bar, and 15 wall balls. So if you were paying attention in the intro, 15 was the smallest chunk of any wall ball set. So the very first year they showed up in the Open, that was the very smallest chunking in the history of any stage of the competition that it's actually been tested. That was 11.5. 12.4 the next year was a 12-minute AMRAP of 150 wall balls, 90 double unders, and 30 ring muscle ups. So we just went to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Again, the largest chunking of any test has been 150, and there it showed up. So basically doing Karen, the benchmark workout, into 90 double unders, 30 ring muscle ups, which was an AMRAP. 2013, 13.3 was a repeat of 12.4. 14.4. 14-minute AMRAP, 60 calorie row, 50 toes to the bar, 40 wall balls, 30 cleans, 135.95, 20 ring muscle ups. 15.3. 14-minute AMRAP, 7 ring muscle ups, 50 wall balls, 100 double unders. 16.4 was a 13-minute AMRAP, 55 deadlifts, 225, 155, 55 wall balls, 55 calorie row, and 55 handstand push-ups. 2017 was a repeat of 2016, so 17.4 was 16.4. 2018, there was no wall balls in the Open that year. Good year. 19.1 was a 15-minute AMRAP of 19 wall balls and a 19 calorie row. 20.5 was 4 time, but had a 20-minute time cap. And it was the partition as desired, like choose your own adventure type year. So it was accumulate, and as you see fit, 40 ring muscle ups, 80 calorie row, and 120 wall balls. 2021, no wall balls again in the Open. So let's move on to quarterfinals. This was the individual quarterfinals. I only did it for 2021. Event 3 did have a wall ball workout. So it was 4 time, 120 wall balls, and 120 row cows. And that was it for quarterfinals. Let's move on to the age group online qualifier. I realize now this is the age group quarterfinals. However, the history of these is always super important. If we understand where we're coming from, we can probably have a better idea of where we're headed. And CrossFit as an organization has always come back to its roots and its benchmarks and its previous tests. So I think it's really important that we look at this. That being said, we're looking at 2014 through 2021, which is the years that the age group online qualifier actually existed in that format. Of all those years, there was one wall ball event. That's it of that entire time. So 2014 through 2021, there was only one wall ball workout. It was in 2014, so the very first year that this was actually held. So 2015 through 2021, there were no wall balls in any of the age group online qualifier events, which is very interesting if you compare that to the Open. So this one event that we had in 2014, it was event 4 that actually had the wall balls. It was 4 time, 100 pull-ups, 100 wall balls. Let's move on to the games. I actually want to start with the age group games. And this was included in the averages that I gave at the beginning. The age group games 2018 event 2. It was 4 time with a 4-minute cap. So it was a very short time cap here. 40-foot handstand walk obstacle course. 20 wall balls, and these are actually heavy wall balls, so 30 pounds and 20 pounds to 10 and 9 feet, and then 40-foot handstand walk obstacle course once again. So 40-foot obstacle course, 20 wall balls, heavy, 40-foot handstand walk obstacle course. 2017 event 9, again, this is the age group games. It was 4 time with a 15-minute time cap, 10 ring muscle ups, 30 wall balls, 50-foot handstand walk. 25-foot sandbag carry, 200 pounds for males, 150 pounds for females. And then back through 10 ring muscle ups, 30 wall balls, 25-foot handstand walk, 25-foot sandbag carry, 10 ring muscle ups, 30 wall balls, 50-foot sandbag carry. 2016 age group games event 1, 4 time. It was a 20-minute time cap. It was sort of an out and back chipper, with the wall balls being right smack in the middle at the turnaround point. So it was 8 deadlifts at 365, 255, 40 GHDs, 80 double unders, 4 rope climbs, 80 wall balls, and then back through 4 rope climbs, 80 double unders, 40 GHDs, and 8 deadlifts. Now let's go into just the regular old CrossFit Games, the individuals, the open category. Again, all the events. CrossFit Games 2009 Event 4 was 3 rounds for time, 30 wall balls and 30 squat snatches at 75-45. 2011, the end 1, 2, and 3. So this was like one event that they repeated 3 times, and each time they had a slightly longer cap on that event. And they had I think it was only like a 1-minute reset in between these. So in practicality, I counted these as 3 separate events, but realistically, this was sort of like structured like one event that was scored 3 different ways. So it was 4 time, 20 calorie row, 30 wall balls, 20 toes to bar, 30 box jumps, 20 kettlebell sumo deadlift high pulls, 30 burpees, 20 shoulder to overhead, and a 200-foot sled pull. So each time they went through, as the time caps went up, they got a little deeper into that workout. There you have it. Those are all the events. So let's go back through and do a little bit more statistical analysis here. The wall balls, in terms of their open appearances, you have a 16.7% chance of seeing wall balls in the open. So that means that it showed up in 9 out of the 54 events that have been in the history of the CrossFit Open through 2021. If we compare that to wall ball games appearances, I'm talking about this as individual games appearances, the open division, you have a 2.4% chance of seeing that. So it showed up in 4 out of 168 events. And those are scored events. We could actually say it was probably only 2. It was the 3 rounds for time one, and it was the end, but it was counted as 3 events. So I could have actually probably had this well below 1% if we don't count it in that way, but I'm counting it as individual events. So if we compare the odds of you seeing wall balls in the open versus the odds of you seeing wall balls at the games, obviously you're way more likely to see wall balls in the open setting. You're actually 7.3 times as likely to see wall balls in that open setting, in an open event, than in the games. Let's go into some more data analysis. Like I mentioned in the intro, the smallest chunking, that was 11.5 that very first year that they actually showed up, is 15 reps at a shot. So what that means, I'm putting my interpretation on this stat now, is that I think that CrossFit as an organization probably realized that there's not enough separation value, even in a 20-minute AMRAP with 15 as the chunking. I think that's just too small, and that they realized that if you want to create some separation value for testing the best athletes in the world, having bigger chunks of this movement, because you're not making it harder, because you're not making the wall ball exponentially heavier and heavier like you could with the barbell. Like, they're just used to standard heights and weights typically. So that being said, I think there wasn't enough separation value. That's my interpretation of those results. The largest chunking was the very next year when we looked at 150 reps. Again, Karen is a very classic benchmark workout. It's 150 wall balls for time. And again, it's to these standard heights and weights, 20 pounds for males, 14 pounds for females, not 10 feet for males, 9 feet for females. So if I didn't ever say like this is actually what it was, those that you can assume that's what it was, right? Because again, if we're trying to have an event where as many people as possible can do it, you're going to keep these to standard heights and weights, right? So again, I often compare wall balls to something like, muscle ups. Like, muscle ups are the highest skill gymnastic in the sport. However, it's still not enough just to be doing, sets of 2, right? And have that in a workout where it's just like you're chasing your tail the whole time. There's not enough separation value in a workout like that if you're testing for the best athletes in the world. Like, these people can do 25 plus unbroken ring muscle ups. So you have to be able to test and be able to create some separation value there. So I think that's why they're moving towards larger chunking as we go deeper into the years. The average chunking, again, of all of those workouts was 57. And again, this is very important because if we're thinking about, how should we be building our capacity in terms of creating workouts and training protocols, the average chunking, 57 reps when you're being tested. So probably, it does not saying you have to go all the way to there when you're in training. However, thinking about that as sort of your baseline, okay, if wall balls are showing up in a set, there's a good chance that they're going to be 50 plus, right? So just understanding that. 2 things that I want to note about those chunking statistics. Number 1 is that this didn't include duplicates. Like, for example, if we had a repeat from 16.4 to 17.4, I didn't include 17.4. I only included that first one. I also didn't include 20.4, which was your choose your own adventure, because each person could have split the wall balls up differently. So chunking didn't really make sense for that. And then I I'm using this through the 2021 season. So data in 22 season and beyond is not included in that data. So that was chunking. So another important statistic that we can be looking at from this data is looking at functional volume. I recently wrote a pro article on functional volume in terms of looking at open functional volume. And this is how I defined functional volume in that article. It is the maximum number of contractions in a movement that an athlete will perform based on the testing parameters of his or her sport. So in CrossFit, we got to not just look at what's the testing parameters, but then also like which stage of the competition are you peaking for. So functional volume for the CrossFit Games is not going to be the same as the functional volume for the Open. The functional volume for someone who placed 10,000th in the Open is not going to be the same as someone who placed in the top 100. And that's actually how I broke down this pro article. I looked at each movement, each instance in the Open that it actually appeared, and then based on what, how many reps did the top 100 do, how many reps did the top 1,000 do, how many reps did the top 10,000 do, and then being able to average that across all of the years to determine what is the average functional volume. So I want to talk through the wall ball portion of that. I did this for every single movement in the CrossFit Open. Yes, it took me a long time. So if you're interested in that, check that out. You can go to ZOARfitness.com/pro to check out the pro membership. You can get a 7-day free week. So let's take a peek at this analysis. I'll be looking at both males and females. We'll start with the males. 15.3, a top 100 male did 199 reps of wall balls. 19.1 was 193 reps for that top 100 male. If we compare that to the 1,000th, it went from 199 to 159 in 2015. In 2019, it went from 193 to 183. So you can see the depth of field is improving across time. And then the 10,000th place was 199, 159 for 1,000, 140 for the 10,000. And then 119.1 was 193 for top 100, 183 for top 1,000, and then 10,000 was 162. So a little bit more of a drop off, right? We can compare that to things like 16.4 and 17.4. However, one of the key things here is you're only going to see 55 reps across most of these because that's all you're actually required to do in one round of that workout. And most people, other than the top males in 2017, actually made it back through an entire another round of that. So the average of all of those was for the top 100 male was 128 reps of wall balls, right? So that would be on the lower end of functional volume. But if you look at the individuals, again, if you're a top 100 male, this means that realistically you should be preparing to be able to handle 200 wall balls, because we saw 199 in 2015, 193 in 2019. And this is the sort of thing that you can do for any movement. But again, for a top male, you're looking at close to 200 wall balls being functional volume. If we do the same thing for a top female, in 2015, you're looking at 150 reps for a top 100 female finisher in the Open. If we compare that to 2019, you're looking at 171 reps for a top 100 finisher. If we look at the 1,000th place, 2015 was 138, 2019 was 152. So again, in general, because something like 19.1 that was tested with row calories and it wasn't scaled for females, you're going to see that the functional volume for females is just a touch less. And then also, especially in the earlier years of the Open, the depth of field across male and female was less, but especially in the female side of things was less. So the average for the top 100th place, again, including 16 and 17 and 20.5, all those years, was 110 wall balls versus the males were 128. So again, if we're a top 100 finisher for females, we're looking at 150 plus wall balls, anywhere from maybe 150 to 175, certainly being well within functional volume. And then if you're not quite as high of a placer, 1,000 versus 10,000, you can degrade from there. So I know that might have been confusing. Let's take a step back and look at this. Basically, you need to figure out, okay, relative to the testing body and what has shown up before, how many wall balls am I actually going to have to do in a workout? Or what are the odds of me having to actually do that? So again, if I was just to blindly prescribe this to someone who's a pretty good athlete, I would say you should be probably doing more than 100 wall balls in a session, and you probably don't need to be doing over 200 wall balls in a session. And when you actually enter those into your workouts, probably don't do less than 15 at a shot. However, it's also probably not necessary for you to be doing over 150 at a shot without a break. Okay. And I understand those are very wide guidelines, but that's the sort of thing that we can start to think about. So that's the end game, right? That's where we want to go. The real question now is like, how do we get there? How do we get to expressing our fitness on a test like that, right? And the first place to go, in my opinion, is not to training. Everybody wants to go to training. Tell me the protocol. Tell me what I need to do to get better. It's not fitness yet, right? Before fitness is movement. Movement is the foundation to be able to express your capacity. So let's take a step back. Let's look at and try to analyze the movement of a wall ball a little bit better. So let's get into part 2. How do wall balls differ from other seemingly similar movements? So it's simple in theory. It's like a squat plus a press. It's no different than something like a thruster, right? Yeah, I don't think so. I think it is unique. What is unique about it? So I think first of all, we can understand that with something like a front squat or a thruster, you are decelerating as you get towards the top of the movement. So as you stand up out of that thruster, rather than smacking up against end range, you slow down as you get towards end range and you lock out slowly or relatively slowly. You decelerate. Versus if you're throwing an object, your only choice is to accelerate through the entire range of motion, right? So the reason why people do things like jump squats to potentiate for things like heavy back squats is because you have to accelerate through the entire range of motion. It's why people use things like accommodating resistance, like bands and chains for powerlifting work, right? It's the same idea. If you can continue to make that movement harder as you get towards end range, you accelerate through. That's, again, that can elicit a strength adaptation, but if we're talking about, maximizing our movement for a specific type of exercise, that's an entirely different thing. It's just something that we need to understand is unique about the movement. What else is unique? Well, you release and catch the ball. This is not something that you do most of the time in CrossFit. So it actually requires quite a bit more precision and accuracy and coordination than a lot of the other movements, right? Obviously, something like a snatch, you have to be very coordinated to do. However, it's a different kind of coordination when you have to release and catch again. So what else is unique? Well, you're holding an object in your hands versus having it resting, like something like a front squat, having it resting on the front rack. So the idea, if you're someone who's a very efficient athlete, you can rest a bar across your collarbones, across your delts, and have that front rack, that front shelf to support the bar. And you really don't have to have a lot of active muscle activation to be able to hold it there. Yes, through your upper back, through your rectors, through, the rest of your chain. However, in terms of using a lot of shoulder and pec, upper back to really stabilize that position, it's not necessary, right? Obviously, it does as you get to heavier loads, but you're not doing 150 thrusters in a set typically, right? Where you can do that with wall balls or in a chunk. So this idea that you're holding an object in your hands is, again, unique about this. And I find that often people who are inefficient with a front rack are actually better at wall balls because they have more chest, shoulder endurance because they've just had a crappy position for all the other movements that they're doing with the front rack. And as a result, they probably have better capacity, even if their efficiency isn't very high. So they might not be near as good at front squats or thrusters or other, again, movements that seem similar to wall balls. However, they probably actually have maybe a higher capacity for just raw movement potential and that muscle ability. So oftentimes those people are actually better at wall balls, which is kind of funny. Another thing that's different is as you're holding a wall ball in your hands, there's an isometric contraction that's happening, right? Anytime you're having to hold something, it means that you're, again, having an isometric, meaning non-moving contraction of that muscle. Think of it as like a wall sit, right? If anyone's ever done a wall sit, you know that those burn really bad. So not only is it going to be burning up that muscle, but then when you have an isometric contraction, that often will spike your blood pressure, will often spike your heart rate afterwards as a result. So you're kind of working against yourself in that way. What else is unique about wall balls? Well, they're light, right? They're not heavy squats. So if you're having a moderate or a heavier squat, there's a certain pattern that happens in that stretch shortening cycle, that stretch reflex out of the bottom of your squat. And that gets impacted when you do wall balls because the wall ball is so light that you're not really you don't get that same response or kind of feel out of the bar because the weight's so light. So the way that you brace and breathe and actually move through the movement is just different because it's lighter and you don't need as much tension to do that. And the last thing that's unique is breathing, right? I think this is underappreciated, but since the cycle speed of wall balls is different than other squatting movements, the time it's going to take for each rep, then the breath pattern also has to be different, right? You have to do wall balls at sort of a set cadence because you throw it, it takes some time to hit the target, it takes some time to come back down, and then as soon as you catch it, you descend into your squat. So you have less options, whereas if you're doing, again, if I just compare this to a traditionally weighted squat, like a front squat, you stand up, you can take as long as you want in between those reps or as short as you like or no time between those reps, right? You have a lot more play in cycle speed where you do not have those options as much in wall balls. So I've personally thought a lot about wall balls, and I want to give some tips about things that have worked for the movement. Again, we're talking about movement, not in terms of training protocols for me, right? So what things have actually I've played with? I'm not saying that they're going to work for you. That's not what I'm saying. However, I think there's probably some things that just listening to them that you could probably pick around or pick up, play with, things that you could adopt and hopefully get some additional efficiency out of it. So number one is a consistent entry point. What I mean is how you actually pick up the ball, your stance, and then how you go about entering rep one. Seems trivial, but if you have to break 150 wall balls 15 times because you're doing sets of 10, then you got 15 times that you have to do this. If you save half a second or you save 5% of your energy expenditure, right, you're improving yourself. So let's think about the consistent entry point. So where are you putting your stance in terms of width? Like how far apart are you standing with your feet? Is it the same as a traditional heavy squat? Is it a little bit wider? Is it narrower? What can you play with to make it work for you? For me, I like slightly wider because I can actually feel a little bit more pop out of my hips and I don't actually get as much depth. I actually try to limit my depth where I meet the standard, but I don't go excessively deep in my wall ball squat. That's something that has definitely helped me. Trying to limit the range of motion while still meeting the standard. The distance from the wall. So typically I'll stand upright and I'll put my hand out. And if often you do wall balls in front of a wall, the idea is that you should be able to touch, keeping your shoulders square, be able to touch the wall. And that's a good distance to be away from the wall. So it's kind of a little check each time. And then you pull underneath the ball. So basically you're doing like a bicep curl as you squat down into rep one rather than standing it up the entire way and then descending into your squat to get a big eccentric portion out of that, right? So you go straight and down to the bottom of the rep. Some other things for me, the front rack has been something that I've quote front rack because I don't really think it's a front rack, so to speak. But that's something that I've definitely played around with, like that hand and thumb position. So the more underneath the ball you are holding, literally the less distance that you have to throw it. So if you're holding the ball on the sides, you might be sitting 2 to 3 inches higher versus if you put your hands down a little bit lower on like the bottom half of the ball, all of a sudden you literally move the ball up maybe 2 to 3 inches in space, which means that, again, you're saving 2 to 3 inches on every single throw. If you're doing 150 throws in a workout, that becomes a really big, reduction in total distance that you actually have to throw the ball and less energy expenditure. Also, I really like putting my thumbs onto the ball where I kind of don't have my palms flat against the ball, but it's more like I kind of like push the knuckle out of my thumb and kind of hold it and sort of pinch it between my thumbs in that way. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's something that if you can play around with how you actually are holding it with your hands and specifically with your thumbs, it'll definitely make a difference. 3, I like to think about a tripod of contact. So what I mean is obviously 2 hands, but then chin to the ball as well. If you're holding that ball away from your body, like where it's further away from your chest, that's further away from your center of mass, and it's going to put way more strain onto your upper back and onto your chest and your delts as well, because it's not just like back, it's also shoulders, chest that are involved in that as well. So if you can think about either holding, and I've seen people do this multiple ways, but either high, where it's actually above your chin the entire time, where you don't bring it down all the way to your chest, or right in front of your chin where you're kind of like breathing onto the ball where you can almost kiss it, and then all the way down to your chest like you're actually holding it in sort of like a front rack type position. or somewhere between, right? I've seen athletes do that in a number of different ways, but I think playing around with that and figuring out what's going to work best for you is definitely something that you should be playing around with. 4 is squat mechanics, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but for me, that wider stance actually creates more tension in my hips, which is why I don't squat that way for things like heavy squats. If I'm doing heavy back squats, I tend to have just a slightly narrower stance. For wall balls, I exaggerate the width of my stance just maybe 2 inches aside. And what that allows for is just a little bit of more hip tension and a little bit more pop and good change of direction out of my squat, while again limiting depth beyond like just so I barely meet the standard, but no more than meet the standard, right? The goal should not be to just move as far as you can here. Again, the weight is light, so you should be able to produce a good change of direction. The other thing that I think that helps me with is, without slightly wider squat stance, is having a little bit more of an upright torso in my squat. The last thing you want to do is what like the level 1 would call like an immature squat, where you're hinging over as you come like down into your squat, and then you have to stand back up and like sort of get your hips back underneath your body to be able to throw again. That's a really inefficient sort of like a 2-step action to your squat. Whereas if you can stay upright the entire time, it allows you to, again, sort of piston just straight up and down in your squat, and allows for, just overall more efficient, quick movement, which is the name of the game. 5 would be to drop your hands. So I know different people do this different ways, where you could either like windmill out and around, where you drop your hands that way. I personally just like, after I throw the ball, just bring my hands straight down for a second around to maybe like sternum level, and then bring them back up as the ball comes down, so I can catch and sort of meet it just above my face level and sort of absorb the shock a little bit better. I know some people catch it right at their chest really low, and they let it fall a little bit more before they catch it. I personally don't like that because I feel like it messes up my hand position. And again, I want an exact hand and thumb position each time I catch that ball, because it's like I'm catching a clean or something where it's dynamic every single time, every single rep, it's a new catch. So I'm trying to make that as consistent as possible while still relaxing my shoulders. The reason why I'm doing that, if you haven't done this or haven't really thought about it, hold your hands above your head for 3 minutes. Don't do this if you're driving, obviously. But if you're just watching this, right, hold your hands above your head for like 3 minutes. And I guarantee, that's not even the time it takes you to do Karen. Hold it above your head for 5 minutes. If you did unbroken Karen, that's what it would take. You're going to realize how tired your shoulders get just from holding your hands up. So it's important that you can relax your shoulders as much as you can while still having a precise catch of each time you do the ball. Number 6 would be accuracy. So being as precise as possible with where you throw the ball on the target. You don't want no reps, obviously, because that's wasting a ton of energy. However, you also don't want to be throwing that ball well higher than it needs to be. So again, this is something where you're not going to do that with something like a thruster. You're not going to move it 6 inches further than you need to. However, with a wall ball, that happens all the time, where you overthrow the target. And it also messes up how you're actually, you might not be at the right spot in terms of where you're standing in space, or, it just throws you off in your cadence a little bit in your rhythm. So the more predictable and accurate that you can be in your throws, it's going to be very helpful in having predictability and has sustainability in the movement. So what I like to think about in terms of accuracy and precision is trying to throw a knuckleball. So a knuckleball, I don't play baseball, I don't know if this is completely accurate, but the idea is that it doesn't really spin as much, right? So for me, that's really what I'm thinking about, is minimizing any spin that I get on the ball, where it goes up, it's not rotating at all, it touches the target, and then it reverses directions without ever like spinning or kind of moving around in space. And again, the idea there is that it's predictable each time, because if it's spinning, it makes it really challenging to catch in exactly the same way each time. And that's exactly what you want. And the last one is breathing. I've played around with this a lot, and I think I finally found something that works well for me. Breathing in wall balls, as I said, it's different than any other strength movement. And the cycle speed is just different. So it's a recipe for blowing up if it's not something that you've experimented with before and something that you've played with. So I want to kind of dive into this a little bit more. Most athletes, when they are breathing for a wall ball, use a 1-to-1 breath ratio. Or I should say most intermediate athletes, I found this is what they use naturally. So they mimic their breath pattern for something like a back squat, like they would for a wall ball. And I will kind of get into why this is an issue, but the 1-to-1 breath ratio is saying that you are having one breath for one rep. So inhale during the lower, hold for a brief fraction of a second, and exhale as you raise. Again, that's very typical, but I think it's also almost impossible for most athletes to maintain. So realistically, if this is the breath pattern you're holding, when you're exhaling as you stand, you throw the ball, and now you're on a empty lung, right? You've exhaled your air, and you have to wait, because you're inhaling as you descend in your squat. You have to wait to actually inhale while that ball's in the air the entire time. You have to wait for it to change directions, and then you can finally inhale when you actually catch the ball and descend in your squat. So you're trying to take this huge breath, and you're basically holding on an exhale, like a breath pause, as you're actually having that ball up in the air. So if it feels like you're suffocating when you're doing wall balls, you might be, right? You really might be, because you're having to breathe so slow. Like, you're probably breathing around 30 reps a minute. It typically takes people 1.8 to 2 seconds to do a wall ball. And that's meaning that you're really probably only be getting close to 30 breaths a minute, which is relatively slow if you're at a high work rate, which is going to be the case, especially if you're someone who's intermediately fit at wall balls, right? You're not going to be able to sustain that breath pattern, because the amount of carbon dioxide that you're building up in your system and just your systemic work rate is too high to be able to sustain that. Basically, you're working too hard, right? You got to breathe harder. So what I would recommend for most people is taking a 2-to-1 breath to rep ratio. So in other words, you now go from breathing at 30 breaths per minute, respiration rate of 30, to now a respiration rate of 60 breaths per minute, which is fast, but I think it matches the work rate much better for most athletes. So again, if we think about, okay, I need to just breathe twice as often, what most people end up doing is they take that exact same breath pattern that they were doing before, inhale on the lowering phase, exhale on the raising phase, and that process takes a little bit longer, and then they have to try to get a second breath in as that ball is actually up in the air, and they end up having like a nice full breath while they're actually doing their squat, and sort of a half, like, cut shallow breath on the top half of that breath. So it ends up being kind of awkward, and they don't ventilate nearly as efficiently as they could. The thing that we need to do is disassociate ourselves from a strength movement like a back squat and figuring out, I just need to be breathing as effectively as possible for a wall ball. A wall ball is a low tension movement, so I don't need to be inhaling and holding as I go down to my squat. So the solution to this that I found and works really well for the athletes that I've implemented with is exhaling as you descend in your squat. So breathing out as you go down, and then breathing out basically as the wall ball actually impacts the target. So you'll be breathing out as you descend in your squat, breathing out as the ball goes through the air and impacts the target. And that means that now those 2 breaths that you're doing per rep are spread out much more evenly, and you can get 2 full breaths for each 1 rep that you're doing. So I realize that might seem confusing, but I think what we need to understand is that you can play around with your breathing in different movements, and we don't have to be dogmatic in how we think about this and how you need to be breathing. So I think a good example of this is I was watching Josh Bridges do push-ups on his Instagram, and he was at a high work rate. He was doing skiing and push-ups, and when he was coming back in to do his push-ups, you could actually, most people, they would compare push-ups to something like bench press. So you would exhale as you're pressing up, and then you'd inhale as you're lowering back down. You'd hold that 1-to-1 breath to rep ratio in that way. Josh was still holding a 1-to-1 breath to rep ratio, but he was doing it in the opposite breath cycle. So he would breathe out as his chest impacted the floor. You could hear his chest hit the floor, and he kind of added that exhale onto that, which, if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. Why would you not be exhaling as your chest is impacting the floor and it's assisting that exhale, the movement? And then as he pressed up, he inhaled, right? So it's the opposite. So we can get out of this, mindset of what is ideal for strength training. That's not necessarily what is ideal for in a workout, even if it's the exact same movement. So we have to consider load. We have to consider systemic work rate if we want to think about breathing ideally in a workout like this. So these are all things that I would play around with. So all the items that I would, again, think about would be your setup, your squat stance, your hand position, having a tripod of contact with your two hands and your chin, dropping your hands so you can actually relax your shoulders, throwing a perfect knuckleball, and then breathing as much as you can to maximize your overall movement efficiency. So all these things are going to allow you to have better movement efficiency. So in other words, all that stuff, you didn't have to get more fit to get better at it. Like you didn't need more capacity, yet you were better, right? So you were more efficient. Now let's talk about getting better from a physiological standpoint. So now let's talk about improving your fitness for wall balls. We're going to get into protocols for part 3, training wall balls. So the place that I would start if I was an athlete listening to this and I want to improve my wall ball capacity. If you are not doing wall balls at least once or twice per week in your workouts, then you don't need some fancy protocol. You just need to do more wall balls. Like so often I start with an athlete and we're doing their onboarding process for one-on-one coaching. And I'm talking to them like, what things you need to work on. They're like, okay, well, the Olympic lifts aren't great for me. Particularly like, snatch is something that just hasn't come natural for me. I'm like, okay, how many times per week do you snatch? And they're like, well, I kind of do it once per week in strength work, and then I might hit it again in a Metcon. I'm like, all right, well, you just got to snatch more. Like if you do that once per week, like how much better can you actually expect to get? So Jeff Baltimore, he was on The Fitness Movement, episode number 22. He writes my weightlifting programming, and we were in conversation one time, and he's like saying how snatching is like throwing a baseball. And I don't want to put words into his mouth, but I think he's referring to both of those movements are highly requiring high levels of coordination, and they're as much about timing and coordination as they are about strength. Like imagine if you were a professional soccer player and you went out and dribbled once per week. Like you're just not ever going to get to the level that you need to be at, and you're not going to have acquiring the skills because they're not showing up in the frequency. A very important aspect of motor learning new skills and refining them, is frequency. It's not just about the volume that you're doing or the intensity that you're doing that at in terms of load, percent of your 1 rep max. It's like, can you just show up and do it? It's consistency, right? The old MCI, mechanics, consistency, then intensity. I think in this aspect, that principle makes a lot of sense. So step 1 to get better at wall balls would just be to do more wall balls, right? The format really doesn't matter. You just need to do them for at least a couple of months and see how things go, right? Consistent exposures. So step 2 then would be to check your chunking and your volume. So you don't necessarily need to change a lot. More so just do some pre or post game analysis of the workouts that you're already doing and seeing where you're at. So it should be, the workouts that you're doing should be both functional volume and, I guess I'll coin a new term, functional chunking as well, right? So the amount that you're doing in the total in a workout should be, again, functional in the sense that you're doing the amount that's required for your sport, but the chunking should also be functional, right? So it should be maybe 15 to 50 reps in your workouts would be kind of a good range to just get baseline and start from there, right? So again, that's what I would look for. Are you doing anywhere from 15 to maybe even 75 or 100 reps at a shot, and then doing that in rounds for time or some sort of format until you accumulate 100 to 200 total reps, depending on your fitness level and if you're a male versus a female. So then I would track your volume and your chunking and your average density and make sure that those things are trending in the way that you want them to go. So looking at them and saying, okay, I'm either going to be building the number of reps that I'm doing at a shot, the number of reps that I'm doing in the total workout, or the frequency and the reps per minute that I'm doing those reps, volume, chunking, density. So depending on the format that you go about, you may actually know these numbers before you actually do a workout. So if you're doing sets and that's each, you're doing 5 sets of 15, you know exactly how many wall balls that is at the end of your workout. If you're doing intervals or an EMOM format, anything like that, you're going to know the volume before you give it to them. And this is a very important principle for coaches to understand as well. That is a work priority, right? So you don't know what the time it's going to take. However, you know the amount of work, the volume, and the chunking that athlete's going to do. Or you could give them something that is time priority where you don't know the volume that they're going to accumulate. So this would require some post-game analysis, so to speak, where if you give someone an AMRAP, as many rounds as possible, you know how long that's going to take. It's a 15-minute AMRAP, for example. However, you don't know how many wall balls they're actually going to accumulate across that time, right? Because you can't predict their capacity on that particular day exactly as it's written, right? So in that case, there's some other things that you can maybe control, but you don't know the total volume. So I'm not saying one's necessarily better than the other, but it's just something that you need to be able to pay attention to and track over time and make sure it's trending in the direction that you want. So let's say we've had an athlete and they've gone through steps 1 and 2. So they've done more wall balls and they've also double checked their wall ball workout. So they know that they're doing functional volume and functional chunking within those workouts. Then I think if they've done that for a couple months consistently and it's still like wall balls are still a problem for them, then they can go to step 3, which step 3 is doing tailored progressions and protocols. Now, as with everything else, I think it's best to keep things simple to start. I want to outline a really simple progression. This is actually from our wall ball movement page on the website. And Jeff Baltimore and a couple people at 1440 Athletics actually went through this exact progression with heavy wall balls and saw some really good results. It was actually funny because I didn't really mean this to be something that was actually executed upon. It was sort of just an example, but it turns out it worked pretty well for him. So for those of you who don't know, the movement library, it's featured on the website. It's basically a breakdown of different movements that are common in the sport of fitness. So it's very similar to what I'm doing on these podcasts, but with a text and video format of different techniques. So there's a lot of information on there. If you're interested, it's on a tab from the homepage. It's pretty simple to find if you just go to ZOARfitness.com. That being said, let's get into this progression. So let's say we have somebody and they test Karen. It's 150 wall balls for time, and that person gets 12 minutes. That's a density of 12.5 reps per minute. Someone like that, this protocol might be effective for. Week 1, they're doing a 10-minute EMOM of 10 wall balls, which if you're doing 110 minutes, that's 10 reps per minute. Week 2 would then just be to add 1 minute. You're doing an 11-minute EMOM of 10 wall balls. Week 3 is an 8-minute EMOM of 14 wall balls. So the time came down, but the density went up. Week 4, back to a 10-minute EMOM, but now of 12 wall balls. Week 5 was a 9-minute EMOM of 14 wall balls. And week 6, was the final week, was an EMOM for 10 minutes and is 15 wall balls. So basically now they did Karen in 10 minutes where the original test was in 12. And now that means that their density went from 12.5 reps per minute up to 15 reps per minute. So a simple progression like that can really help somebody see results. And it's not something that's super time intensive, and it can be pretty punchy and effective for someone like that. So if you're an athlete and you've been doing this and you've been doing wall balls consistently for a few months of 2 to 3 times per week, and you're making sure that you're having functional volume and functional chunking, and maybe you've gone through some sort of semi-linear progression like I outlined in those EMOMs, then you still don't have the capacity that you want for wall balls, then what, right? Now I think it's time to sort of get a little bit more down into the nitty gritty of what's going on with the movement and to figure out what specific thing is limiting you. So thinking about what is going to be your rate limiting process. So what system is slowing you down? Most people are going to be limited by one of 3 things: their respiratory system, their cardiac system, or their muscular system. So if it's the respiratory system, they're probably not breathing in the right way, right? They can't ventilate enough based on their current breath pattern that they're holding. That could be something as simple as changing their breath ratio like we talked about before, and exhaling as they ascend in their rep and exhaling again as they throw the ball. Could be their cardiac system, where they just don't have enough stroke volume or total cardiac output to be able to deliver oxygen effectively to the muscles and to be able to clear CO2 and metabolites from the working muscle. Or it could be their muscular system, where they just don't have the muscular endurance that they need, or even the contractile potential that they need to be able to effectively do wall balls in big sets. So let's go through these one by one. Our first rate limiting process is muscle endurance. So this is if when you're doing wall balls, you're not necessarily breathing super hard, like you don't feel like you're hyperventilating, but your muscle feels like it's burning and you start to fail reps because of that. Like you just can't throw the ball high enough to hit the target, and that's what's slowing you down. You probably have a muscular endurance limiter. So here's a simple progression that you could go through. I actually went through this progression myself. I stole this from Chris Hardenberg. It worked pretty well for me, and saw some good results for it. Like my max wall ball set went up as a result of this progression. So Week number 1, you're doing 5 sets. It's 5 strict press, maybe 75%, rest 15 seconds. 12 incline dumbbell bench press at a moderately heavy weight, rest 15 seconds, and then a max set of wall balls. For me, a max set was when I was forced to jump in those reps, because that happens to be when I get really tired with my shoulders and my chest. I am forced to jump. So that's when I would be capped on that max set of wall balls. I'd rest 2-3 minutes, and then I would repeat that, as I said, for 5 total sets. That was week 1. Week 2, you just go to 6 sets. Week 3, you go to 7. Week 4, you deload, go back to 4 sets. And then week 5, you go to 8 sets. And then you can retest your max set. So that was a really effective protocol for me. Another good example that could be for someone who has issues with workouts with high movement interference, where they're using the same muscle patterns for multiple movements. This would be a great example. EMOM of 15 minutes for the first week. It is a rotating EMOM. So the first minute, you'll be doing 15 seconds of max wall walks. Minute 2, 15 seconds max keeping handstand push-ups. Minute 3, 15 seconds max wall balls. So repeat that 5 times for 15 minutes total. Week 2, you just progress those to an 18-second working window. Week 3, you progress it to a 21-second working window. In week 4, you progress it to a 24-second working window. You could also do this same progression, or you could continue on in this fashion, but now you're going to increase the total duration of the EMOM rather than the working windows. So rather than the density going up, the volume, what you're doing, is going up. So we could start with that exact same 15-minute EMOM with the 15 seconds wall walks, 15 seconds keeping handstand push-ups, 15 seconds max wall balls. But now you're saying week 2, you're doing an 18-minute EMOM. Week 3, you're doing a 21-minute EMOM. Week 4, you're doing a 24-minute EMOM. And then our second rate limiting process, I just want to call these capacity limiters. We're going to ball respiratory and cardiac limiters into one here. You'll know this is you if you feel like when you were doing bigger sets of wall balls, your muscles aren't necessarily screaming at you, but you feel like you just can't, either catch your breath, or you feel like you, just can't keep up with the work rate. Like that's just too high and you're forced to break because of that. So physiologically, I would say for a lot of people, it just probably means that their cardiac output isn't enough to sustain it, which if that is the case and your cardiac output isn't great, meaning that your heart's not as strong and isn't able to put out as much per beat, then that's going to affect your breathing. Like it's going to make you want to hyperventilate more. It's going to affect your muscle endurance. Basically, if your heart isn't being an efficient pump, then your performance in all aspects in terms of fitness is going to be suffering. So we can think of wall balls as sort of being like a fixed output, where if you're doing, again, like 1.8 to 2.0 seconds per rep, you're either doing that or you're taking a break, right? There's really no in between. So if we think about what does that sound like, that fixed output, it sounds like pace. So let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine if you were in the sport of CrossFit and rowing was tested, but this was a special kind of rower, not a Zybex rower, but a rower where it only counts when you are rowing faster than, let's say, 130 per 500 meters if you're a male, or 145 per 500 meters if you're a female. And that's, it either is basically you're not allowed to row slower than that. It either shows it on the screen, hey, you're doing great, you're under that pace, or nope, doesn't count because you're not at that pace. That's basically how we can think about wall balls. Some people, if this was the case and that was the rower, right, they wouldn't be able to get a single calorie because they wouldn't be able to get under that 130 or that 145 pace, right? There could probably be other people who are really fit who could do an entire 150 calories at a shot without ever breaking that. I'll venture to say that most people would be somewhere in between, right? They'd be able to take a chunk of calories and then they'd have to be forced to rest and stop and kind of catch the breath a little bit, and then start back up and try to maintain that pace as long as they can, force to stop and break a little bit. And that's exactly how wall balls are. It's, imagine like an erg that would force you to stop if your output isn't high enough, if your pace isn't fast enough, right? And it forces you to rest. That's what wall balls are like. So if you think about a test like Karen, 150 wall balls for time, that's basically like saying like, that's your threshold. You have to be able to throw the ball high enough to get to a 10-foot or 9-foot target. And if you can't, the reps don't count and you have to break, right? So the idea is if you improve your capacity, that you're going to be able to hold that pace, so to speak, that fixed output for a longer period of time without breaking. And when you break, you won't have to break for as long and you will take bigger chunks. And oftentimes we think of wall balls as like going through X amount of reps at like, no different than we would think about like heavy squats or presses or something like that, versus thinking about it in terms of duration and times and ergs, which should be more like energy systems training. So one of the things I want you to think about is more like, okay, let's treat wall balls more like energy systems training than strength training, or that we would traditionally do with like quote exercises. So let's think about how we can improve someone's capacity on something like energy systems training and incorporate wall balls into that. I think that's the best way to improve someone if they have a cardiac or what I'm calling capacity limiters. Here's an example. I think the examples will help you make a little bit more sense of this. 4 sets, 500 meter row, and then into a AMRAP minus 3 to 5 of unbroken wall balls, rest to 8 out of 10 recovery, and repeat for those 4 total sets. So what this means is that 500 meter row is at a ramping pace. So you're going to increase your wattage or decrease your pace every 100 meters. You're going to end at your 2K time trial pace. So for someone like me, it could be like first 100 meters is 2 minutes. Second, it's 155, then 150, then 145, and then I end at a 140 pace. I hop off the rower. You transition as little as you need, maybe 10 seconds, and then you get into your wall balls. You stop 3 to 5 before failure, and then you rest again till an 8 out of 10 perceived recovery, and then you repeat. And then that progression, you could do the exact same 4 sets next week, and it's auto-regulated because you're doing 3 to 5 from failure of your wall balls, where if you get more reps, you're just going to accumulate more volume. And hopefully, as your fitness improves, it also allows you to get more reps. And this progression, that's what I mean by auto-regulated. It's as your fitness improves, you'll get deeper into it. So that's a really good example of a protocol that I've personally done a lot. Another one could just be like 6 rounds for time, 15 calorie air bike, 25 wall balls, but the wall balls have to be unbroken. Where the progression, again, it could be somewhat auto-regulated where you could just increase your assault bike pace as you're able to hold those unbroken wall balls with more confidence, right? Because if you're more confident, you'll hold a higher assault bike average pace. Or you could just straight up like increase the wall ball volume and say like, okay, this week it was 25. I had to be unbroken. Next week it's 30. Then it has to be unbroken. The next week it's 32 and it has to be unbroken, etc. Or we could do something like a 19.1 progression. And this is actually, again, another one that I actually have done and completed. Week 1 is to actually test your open 19.1. For me, this was just shy of 2 minutes per round, which was about just shy of 8 rounds. Week 2 was a 24-minute EMOM, 17 wall balls, and 30 seconds of rowing. And your score is going to be your cumulative row calories. Week 3, again, a 24-minute EMOM, but now 20 wall balls and a 12-calorie row, and that row has to be at 1350 to 1400 calories per hour. So I assign a specific pace because that's the pace that I wanted to hold for 19.1. Week 4 was an 18-minute EMOM, so total duration is reduced. However, the density is still going up. 22 wall balls in that first minute, 13-calorie row at 1350 to 1400 calories per hour. And that one I put a little bit of like an asterisk next to it and said, if at any point I have to break because I'm not able to actually finish the EMOM, because I knew this was aggressive and that could happen, that you rest for exactly 1 minute and then restart where you left off. And that's a good way to do that, especially if you're a coach and you don't know if an athlete can hold a pace. Hey, if you fail this EMOM, break for exactly 2 minutes and then restart, for example. And then week 5 was every minute and 54 seconds, which is very specific, for 8 total rounds, 19 wall balls, 19 row calories. So there I PR'd my 19.1 score. So I know I threw a lot at you today. If you don't know where to start, I would just pick a protocol that sort of excites you and you think that makes sense for you and commit to running that for the duration of that protocol and that progression. I would test and then retest once you're done and see if it works. See if you actually improve your wall balls and the metrics that you're trying to improve, whether it was specific rep max, whether it was something like Karen or something that was like a hybrid, like a 19.1 test. All those will be good proxies for doing well in an open type test. So test and then reflect a little bit, see what worked, see what didn't work, see what you liked, what did you learn, and then move on from it. That's sort of the training process in a nutshell, and that's how you go about improving your wall ball capacity. Hey, it's Ben again. Thanks for listening today. To be completely honest, it's been really rewarding to have people who listen to the show regularly reach out to me, whether they have a question about training or just to say hey. So if you haven't done that yet, do it. I'm pretty good about getting back to people, and you can feel free to email me, ben@zoarfitness.com, or message me on Instagram @zoarfitness. And graciously, I've had some people reach out to me and ask how they can support the show. Number one way that you can support the show if you are a regular listener is just by rating the show. Most apps have a platform where you can actually rate it, and on Apple Podcasts, you can write a review as well. This is super helpful in having other coaches and athletes find the podcast, but also just having it grow and for me to continue to want to put out more and more content. Also, I'm going to be posting more full episodes of the Fitness Movement to our YouTube channel. So if you're someone who actually enjoys seeing my face when I talk, you can head over to YouTube and subscribe if you please. And if you're someone who is watching on YouTube, you have the ability to like our videos, but then you can also comment on the video if you have questions about the episode or if you want to suggest a topic for a future episode. And lastly, if you're someone who really does value what we're putting out, I would encourage you to hire a coach. For me, coaching is the bulk of my job, and it's what I believe I do best. So if you're an athlete or a coach looking to up your fitness game, be sure to reach out. You can message me on Instagram @ZOARFitness or email me, ben@zoarfitness.com. Thanks again for listening today. And as always, stay the course.